On a chilly Wednesday morning, over our usual breakfast of eggs and toast, Claire casually added a strange new piece to a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been putting together all week. She took a sip of her coffee, glanced up, and said, "Kyle's going to call you today." The comment sounded so casual it nearly slipped right past me. But as her words sunk in, I looked at her with a question in my eyes. Why on earth would he need to call me? I finally asked, trying to keep the confusion out of my voice. Claire didn't look at me directly, just glanced down at her coffee. "He wants to make sure you're comfortable with him taking me to dinner on Friday," she explained, as if that was the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't help but chuckle dryly. "Why?" I asked again, with a bit more edge to my voice. "You already told him you'd go, and you already told me you'd go. So what's the point of him calling me about it?" I saw her jaw clench just a little before she answered. "Ethan, it's a work dinner. We're just going over some ideas for the City Council's green infrastructure project. Kyle and I are putting together the final proposal for next week's meeting, and that's it. You know this isn't some kind of date, so stop trying to turn it into one." "Sure, Claire," I muttered, not really buying it. "But what if I don't want him taking you to dinner?" She looked at me like I'd said something insane. What's that supposed to mean? I set my coffee cup down a little harder than I intended. "It means what if I tell him not to bother calling me, because I don't want him taking my wife out on a Friday night?" She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, like she was trying to keep her temper. "This isn't about getting your permission, Ethan. It's just a courtesy. Kyle wants you to feel comfortable with it because he knows you might be a little, well, possessive sometimes." I leaned back, arms crossed. Possessive? I'm just looking out for my wife's best interests. If he's so respectful, why not meet during the day at the office? Why dinner, and why on a Friday night? Claire's eyes flickered, just for a second, but enough that I noticed. She sighed, trying to keep her voice calm. "Ethan, you don't get it. You've never worked in politics. These kinds of meetings happen over dinners. It's the nature of the job, not some plot to sneak around." I just shrugged, trying to keep my own tone level. "All right then, tell him to call me. I'll tell him I'm fine with it." In reality, I had no intention of putting on any show of friendliness. If he wanted to call me, he could, but I wasn't about to pretend to like the situation. Claire gave a quick nod, looking both relieved and annoyed. "Good. Just be polite, all right? There's no reason for this to be uncomfortable." We wrapped up breakfast, both of us in a tense silence. I left for work, but I couldn't get my mind off the upcoming dinner. Something about the whole setup rubbed me the wrong way, and it wasn't just jealousy. It was the way Claire had gradually shifted the story. First it was a team dinner, then it was a smaller gathering, and now it was just her and Kyle. If this was just a professional dinner, why did the details keep changing? All day, I kept my phone close, waiting for Kyle's call. He finally rang around 4 p.m., and I let it go to voicemail the first time. After a few minutes, I called him back, figuring I might as well get this out of the way. When he answered, he sounded upbeat, a little too friendly. "Ethan, great to finally connect," he started. "Yeah, same," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay with Claire and me having this dinner to go over the final strategy points. It's important work, and we're aiming to make this presentation really solid." I forced a smile he couldn't see. "If it's important for the project, go ahead. Just keep it professional, all right?" Kyle chuckled in that polished, rehearsed way that always grated on me. "Of course, Ethan. This is strictly business. I respect Claire, and I'd never cross any boundaries." "Glad to hear it," I replied, though I could barely keep the edge out of my voice. "Have a good dinner, and make sure she's home by 10. Kyle assured me he'd do just that, but the way he brushed it off only added to my unease. The rest of the evening went by slowly. Claire and I barely spoke over dinner, and by the time she went to bed, I was still wide awake, wondering just what I'd agreed to. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just paranoid. But something about Kyle didn't sit right with me. Friday came around too quickly. Claire spent the morning running errands, then mentioned she was heading out to get her hair and nails done. When she came back, looking a little too put together for a simple work dinner, I couldn't hold back any longer. "New dress?" I asked, watching her closely. Claire glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror, avoiding my gaze. Yeah, thought it was time to treat myself. Besides, I wanted to look nice for the presentation. Or for Kyle. I couldn't help adding. She spun around, her expression hardening. Ethan, this is a work meeting, and you're making it something it's not. I nodded slowly, not pushing it any further. All right, just make sure he gets you home safe. As the clock ticked closer to 6, I found myself pacing, waiting for Kyle to show up. He arrived on the dot, dressed sharply and flashing that too-perfect smile when I opened the door. We exchanged a few polite words, though the air between us felt charged, almost confrontational. Finally, Claire came down the stairs, looking stunning, with her new dress and bold red lipstick. She looked like she was ready for a night out, not a work meeting. Kyle's eyes lit up as he saw her, and they exchanged a quick, familiar smile that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to keep my tone even as I spoke. Have a good night, Claire. See you at 10. Claire nodded, a touch of guilt in her expression as she glanced back at me. Thanks, Ethan. We won't be late. With that, they left, and I was alone, watching the taillights fade down the street. I tried to focus on work, but the night stretched out painfully, each hour making me question what was really happening. Friday night crawled by slowly. I sat in my office, supposedly catching up on work, but my mind kept straying back to Claire. Every time I tried to concentrate, images of her and Kyle together pulled my attention away. The idea of the two of them, alone over dinner, dressed up like that, it felt too familiar, too comfortable. I couldn't shake the sense that there was something more going on than just business. By 9:30, I was restless, pacing back and forth, checking my watch every few minutes. My stomach twisted each time I glanced out the window, expecting to see the glow of headlights pulling into the driveway. But time dragged on, and by 10, I had yet to see any sign of them. 10:30 came and went, and there was still nothing. Finally, at 11, I caved and called Claire's phone. It went straight to voicemail. I left a short message, keeping my tone as even as possible. Hey, just checking in. It's getting late. Give me a call back when you're on your way home. I tried to sit back down and wait it out, but my patience was gone. With every minute that passed, my mind spiraled further, imagining all the worst scenarios. She'd never stayed out this late without checking in, and something about it didn't sit right. Part of me wanted to believe she just lost track of time, but something in my gut told me this was more than that. It wasn't until almost 2 in the morning that I heard the soft rumble of a car pulling up outside. I was wide awake, sitting in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I heard the muffled sounds of Claire and Kyle talking outside the door, her laughter floating through the stillness. She sounded happy, lighthearted. For a moment, I froze, listening to the sound of her voice, so different from the tense conversations we've been having all week. I heard her key turn in the lock, and she slipped inside, careful to close the door softly. She must have thought I was asleep, because she jumped when she saw me sitting there, arms crossed, waiting. Ethan, she whispered, I didn't expect you to be up. I didn't reply immediately, just watched her as she set down her purse, her cheeks flushed and her hair a little disheveled, like she'd been dancing or laughing all night. She seemed to avoid my eyes, her gaze darting to the floor as she started to take off her heels. It's nearly 2 in the morning, I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could manage. I know, she replied, a little too quickly. I'm sorry, we just lost track of time. She glanced up, but her eyes didn't meet mine. She looked at the wall behind me, at the empty space above the couch. Anywhere but directly at me. Lost track of time? I repeated slowly, the words tasting bitter as I said them. Claire, I called you. Left a message. You couldn't even text back? Her hands stilled on her shoes, and she seemed to hesitate before responding. My phone died, she murmured, not quite meeting my gaze. For a moment, I just stared at her, letting the silence grow heavy between us. Finally, I pushed myself up from the couch, walking over to where she stood by the door. A faint scent of cologne hung in the air around her, one that wasn't hers and definitely wasn't mine. The smell was familiar, though, and I recognized it immediately as the cologne Kyle had been wearing earlier that night. I kept my voice low. You smell like him. Claire blinked, momentarily thrown off, then shook her head, forcing a weak smile. Oh, come on, Ethan. We were sitting close. It's probably just from dinner, from being around him all evening. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms again as I held her gaze. Close enough that his cologne clings to your clothes? I don't think so. She faltered, her fingers twisting together as she seemed to search for a response. Ethan, don't do this. It's just, Kyle and I had a long night, that's all. We were going over the proposal, talking about work. Nothing happened. You're reading into this. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to shake off the doubts gnawing at me, to let her explanation be enough. But something didn't sit right, and the more I thought about it, the less I could convince myself it was just my imagination. All right, Claire, I said finally, my tone sharp. Then tell me, why the new dress? Why go through all that effort to get your hair and nails done if this was just a meeting? She looked down, her cheeks flushing a deeper red, a hint of frustration tightening her jaw. I don't know, Ethan. Maybe I just wanted to feel good about myself. Maybe I wanted to look nice. Can I do that? I didn't answer, just watched her, waiting for her to break the silence. Eventually, she sighed, running a hand through her hair, her expression softening as she looked up at me. Ethan, please. I know you don't like Kyle, but he's my colleague. I need to work with him. This is important to me. Can't you just trust me? There was a pleading edge to her voice, and for a brief moment, I almost gave in. But the doubt was still there, lingering beneath the surface. Something about the night didn't add up, and no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. I nodded slowly, the tension between us thick as I stepped back, giving her some space. Fine, I said, my voice cold. But if this really is just work, I want to see the proposal you were working on. She hesitated, her face going pale for a split second before she nodded. Of course. I'll show it to you tomorrow. With that, she slipped past me and headed upstairs, leaving me standing alone in the dim light of the living room. I watched her go, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. But for now, there was nothing I could do but wait and see if her story held up. The next morning, I woke up early, still feeling the remnants of last night's frustration. I was determined to get to the bottom of this, to prove to myself that I wasn't just being paranoid. Claire was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in her hands, looking as if she hadn't slept a wink. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, like she'd spent the whole night wrestling with something she couldn't shake. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, waiting for her to break the silence. She didn't look up, just kept her eyes on her coffee, swirling the liquid around as if it held the answers she didn't want to say out loud. So, I started, keeping my tone casual. Are you going to show me the proposal? She looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten our conversation last night. Oh, yes, of course. It's just upstairs. I can bring it down if you want. I nodded, watching her closely. I'll come with you. No point in dragging it down here. She hesitated, then forced a smile. All right. It's on my laptop. I'll pull it up for you. We went upstairs to her office, and she opened her laptop, logging in with slow, almost reluctant movements. She clicked around for a bit, pulling up various files before finally opening a document titled Green Initiative Proposal, Final Draft. There it is, she said, stepping back as if to give me space to read it. I leaned over, scanning the document. It was a lot of text, mostly the same jargon she'd been tossing around for weeks. City council initiatives, renewable energy targets, environmental impact assessments. It looked legitimate enough, but something about the way she was standing there, fidgeting and avoiding eye contact, made me feel like there was more to this than met the eye. Satisfied for now, I straightened up and looked at her, trying to gauge her reaction. She met my gaze, her expression calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked a lot like guilt. All right, I said, stepping back. I guess that checks out. But Claire, if there's something you're not telling me, now's the time. She looked away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ethan, I've told you everything. You're just looking for reasons to be suspicious. I nodded, not entirely convinced but willing to let it slide for now. Maybe. But if there's anything else, you'd better tell me before I find out some other way." She gave me a long, searching look, as if trying to decide whether to say something more. But after a few seconds, she just shook her head, turning away. "There's nothing, Ethan. Just let it go, all right?" I didn't answer, just watched her as she walked away, feeling the distance between us grow wider with. The weekend crawled by in tense silence. Claire and I moved through the house like strangers, exchanging little more than a few strained words here and there. Every time I looked at her, I saw her standing in that doorway at 2 in the morning, with Kyle's cologne lingering on her clothes. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, that there was more to her night with him than just a work meeting. The doubt was like a stone in my chest, pressing down with each passing hour. Sunday evening, as I was sitting on the back porch nursing a beer, Claire came out to join me. She sat down in the chair next to mine, silent for a few moments, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I could feel the tension radiating off her, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she broke the silence. "Ethan," she started, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I feel like we've been off lately, like you don't trust me." I took a long sip of my beer, trying to keep my response measured. "Maybe that's because you've given me reasons not to." She flinched, and for a second, I almost regretted saying it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I trusted her anymore. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, a sense that she was hiding parts of herself from me. "Ethan," she said, her voice wavering, "nothing happened. I keep telling you that, but you don't seem to believe me. It was just a work dinner. We got carried away with the time, that's all." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she might be lying. Her eyes were earnest, pleading, but there was still something there, something she wasn't saying. "Then why didn't you call?" I asked, my voice low. "Why didn't you check in, or text, or do anything to let me know you were going to be late? You know I would have done that for you." She bit her lip, looking down at her hands. "I told you my phone died. I didn't even realize how late it was until we were on the way back." I nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but not wanting to push it any further. "All right, Claire. I'm trying to believe you, but you're making it hard." She looked at me, her eyes filled with frustration. "I don't know what else to say, Ethan. You're the one making this into something it's not. I'm here with you, aren't I?" I didn't respond. I just turned back to my beer, staring out at the fading light, wondering how things had gotten to this point. Claire stayed for a while, sitting in silence, before finally getting up and heading inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. By Monday, I'd almost convinced myself to let it go, to put the doubts behind me and trust that maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking things. But as the day went on, little things started to pile up. Claire had left her laptop out on the dining room table, open to her work email. I wasn't one to pry, but something about it caught my eye. Her emails were organized, neatly categorized, but one email stood out. It was from Kyle, timestamped from Saturday morning, and the subject line read, "Friday night recap." I stared at the email, my heart pounding, torn between wanting to respect her privacy and the nagging urge to find out what was going on. After a moment of hesitation, I clicked on it. The email opened, revealing a short message. "Claire, I just wanted to say thank you for Friday. It was great spending time with you, and I think we really nailed down some important points for the proposal. Looking forward to our next meeting. Best, Kyle." I sat back, my mind racing. The email was innocent enough on the surface, but something about it didn't sit right. His choice of words, "great spending time with you," felt too personal, too familiar. I could feel the doubt creeping back in, stronger than before. That night, I didn't bring up the email. I wanted to, but every time I looked at Claire, she seemed distant, distracted. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I confronted her, I wouldn't like the answer. So I stayed silent, bottling up the frustration and letting it simmer. As the week wore on, my unease grew into a dull, constant ache. Claire seemed to sense it, but she didn't press, and we both fell into a routine of avoiding each other, like we were tiptoeing around something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I tried to focus on work, to throw myself into anything that would distract me, but every quiet moment brought me back to that night, to the way she looked at Kyle, to the lingering scent of his cologne on her clothes. Friday rolled around again, and Claire announced she'd be working late at the office, finishing up the proposal for the council meeting on Monday. She said it casually, like it was no big deal, but the words hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken tension. I kept my voice neutral, not wanting to give anything away. "All right," I said, watching her closely, "but let me know if you'll be out late." She gave me a small, tight smile. "Of course." She left just after 6, and as the evening wore on, I found myself pacing the house, checking the clock every few minutes, waiting for her to call or text. By 9, there was still no word. I considered calling her, but something held me back. Some stubborn pride, maybe, or a desire to see if she'd reach out on her own. By 11, I'd had enough. I grabbed my jacket and headed out to her office downtown, my mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. I knew it was extreme, maybe even a little irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was hiding something from me. When I arrived at her office building, the place was mostly dark, save for a few lights on the top floor where her team worked. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and headed inside. The building was nearly empty, the hallways silent as I made my way up to her floor. As I stepped into the corridor leading to her office, I spotted her through the glass walls, sitting at her desk with her head bent over her computer. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, a faint frown on her face as she typed. Relief washed over me, mixed with a sense of embarrassment. Here I was, practically stalking my own wife, only to find her working late, just like she'd said. I felt a wave of guilt, ashamed for letting my doubts get the best of me. But as I turned to leave, a movement caught my eye. Down the hall, in the small kitchenette, I saw Kyle. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. His presence here, so late at night, made my stomach twist all over again. I stayed out of sight, watching as he set his phone down and made his way toward Claire's office. He knocked lightly on the glass door, and Claire looked up, a tired smile spreading across her face. She waved him in, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. They talked for a few minutes, too low for me to hear. And then Kyle moved closer, leaning over her desk. Claire laughed softly at something he said, her eyes lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. I'd seen that look before, years ago when we'd first started dating. It was a look of admiration, of attraction, and it felt like a punch to the gut. I watched as Kyle reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away. She just looked up at him, her expression soft, her hand reaching up to touch his for a brief moment before she seemed to catch herself, pulling back and turning her attention back to her computer. That was enough for me. I turned and left, the image of them together burned into my mind, replaying over and over as I made my way back to the car. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and betrayal. When I got back to the house, I sat in the dark, nursing a drink and trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew I had to confront her, to demand the truth, but a part of me was afraid of what I might hear. I wasn't sure I was ready to face the possibility that the woman I'd built my life with was slipping away from me, piece by piece, into the arms of another man. As the hours passed, I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the driveway. She came inside quietly, setting her keys on the table, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found me sitting in the dim light. "Ethan," she said, her voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing up?" I looked at her, my expression unreadable, just thinking about a lot of things. She hesitated, sensing the weight of my words, then slowly nodded. "All right, well, I'm going to bed. Long day." She turned to go, but I stopped her, my voice cold and steady. "I went by your office tonight." She froze, her back to me, her shoulders tensing as she slowly turned back around. "What? Why would you do that?" "I just wanted to see if you were really there," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on hers. "And I saw Kyle. I saw the way he looked at you, the way you looked at him." Her face went pale, her eyes widening as she struggled to find the words. "Ethan, nothing happened. It's not what you think." I stood up, crossing the room until I was standing right in front of her. "Then tell me, Claire." Tell me why you didn't pull away when he touched you. Tell me why you're spending more time with him than you are with me." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her expression a mix of guilt and confusion, as if she didn't know how to explain what was happening between us. In that moment, I realized that maybe she didn't have an explanation. Maybe this was just who she was becoming, slipping away from me piece by piece, lost in a world I could no longer reach. That night, after Claire retreated to the bedroom, I sat alone in the living room, turning over everything in my mind. Every look, every touch, every excuse she'd given me. The doubts I'd tried to ignore had grown into certainties, like pieces falling into place in a puzzle I didn't want to finish. The following morning, I woke up with a sense of grim determination. I couldn't keep living with these suspicions gnawing at me, and I knew I had to confront her directly, demand the truth, even if I wasn't ready to hear it. After breakfast, I found her sitting in the kitchen, reading over some papers for the upcoming city council meeting. She looked up when I walked in, giving me a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. For a moment, I just stood there, studying her, wondering if she'd always been this distant, or if it was something new that had crept in between us. "Claire," I said finally, my voice flat, "we need to talk." Her face tightened slightly, and she set her papers down, folding her hands in her lap. "All right," she replied cautiously. "What's on your mind?" I pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down and leaning forward, my eyes locked on hers. "I want the truth about you and Kyle." For a second, she didn't react, just sat there staring at me, her face expressionless. But then, slowly, she shook her head, a hint of irritation flashing across her features. "Ethan, I've already told you, nothing happened. You're blowing this out of proportion." I felt my patience slipping, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it sure doesn't look that way. I went to your office, Claire. I saw the way you two were together, the way you let him touch you." She let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing her temples as if trying to stave off a headache. "Ethan, that was nothing. We're friends, we work together, and yes, sometimes we get close. But that doesn't mean there's anything going on. You're just seeing what you want to see." I shook my head, my voice growing colder. "What I want to see? Claire, you've been lying to me for weeks, changing your stories, making excuses, going out of your way to spend time with him. This isn't just me being paranoid. This is you hiding something from me, something you don't want me to know." She met my gaze, her expression hardening. "Maybe if you trusted me, this wouldn't be a problem. But you've always been so possessive, Ethan. You don't want me to have a life outside of you." I clenched my jaw, fighting to keep my tone steady. "This isn't about me being possessive, Claire. This is about you betraying my trust, sneaking around with him while trying to convince me it's all in my head." She looked away, her face flushed with anger and maybe a hint of guilt, though she'd never admit it. "I don't know what you want me to say," she muttered. "You've already decided I'm guilty, haven't you? No matter what I say, you're not going to believe me." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I want you to be honest with me, Claire. I want you to tell me if there's something going on between you and Kyle, something more than just work." For a moment, she stayed silent, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, her jaw clenched. I could see the battle playing out on her face, the struggle between defiance and shame. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a cold, resigned look. "You want honesty, Ethan? Fine." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I did get close to Kyle. I might have let things get a little too personal, but it didn't mean anything. It was just something that happened, something that got out of hand." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs, my mind reeling as I tried to process what she was saying. I'd suspected it for weeks, but hearing it from her own mouth was different. It was like the ground had shifted beneath me, leaving me stranded in a place I didn't recognize. "So, you're saying you cheated on me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't an affair. It was just a stupid one-time mistake. Something I regret." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "A mistake? You dressed up for him, spent hours with him, let him touch you, and you're calling that a mistake? She looked up, her eyes flashing with anger. Yes, Ethan, I made a mistake, but I came back to you. I didn't run off with him. I chose to stay, to try to make this work. I felt my fists clench, the anger and hurt building inside me like a storm. You chose to stay? After betraying me, you think staying is enough to make up for it? Her face twisted in frustration. What do you want from me, Ethan? I told you the truth. I admitted my mistake. Isn't that what you wanted? No, I said, my voice hardening. What I wanted was a wife who wouldn't lie to me, who wouldn't go behind my back with another man. We sat there in silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging between us like a dark cloud. I could see the regret in her eyes, the way she wanted to take it all back, but the damage was done. There was no going back to the way things were before. After a long, tense moment, she pushed her chair back and stood up, crossing her arms over her chest. So, what now? Are you going to punish me forever? Or are we going to try to move past this? I stood up, meeting her gaze with a cold, steady look. I don't know if I can move past this, Claire. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She let out a defeated sigh, her shoulders slumping as she looked away. I made a mistake, Ethan. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but it's all I have. I didn't want to hurt you, and I didn't want this to happen, but it did. And now we have to figure out if we can move forward. I wanted to believe her, to hold on to the idea that maybe this was just a terrible lapse in judgment, something we could work through. But the hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. I could feel the walls building up around me, shutting her out, protecting me from the pain of trusting her again. Right now, I need space, I said finally, my voice tight with emotion. I need time to figure out if I can live with this. She nodded slowly, her face blank, as if she'd expected this answer all along. Take whatever time you need. I'll be here. She turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there, alone with my thoughts. I could hear her footsteps fade down the hall, the sound echoing through the empty house. It felt like the end of something, like a door closing on a part of our lives we could never get back. As the day wore on, I found myself pacing the house, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. I wanted to believe that this was just a one-time thing, a mistake that didn't mean anything. But the doubt was still there, gnawing at me, reminding me of every look, every touch, every lie she told to cover it up. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep questioning everything she said, every move she made. I needed to know the whole truth, to hear her admit what had happened in full detail. Only then could I decide if I could forgive her, if I could ever trust her again. That night, as we lay in bed, I turned to her, my voice barely a whisper. Tell me everything, every single detail. She stiffened, turning to look at me in the dim light. Ethan, please, I don't think that will help. Maybe not, I replied, my tone unyielding, but I need to hear it. I need to know exactly what happened between you and Kyle. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse. But finally, she nodded, taking a deep breath as she began to speak, her voice trembling with each word. The silence hung between us, thick and suffocating, as Claire started to speak. She looked down, her fingers twisted together, her voice soft and hesitant. It was just one night, Ethan, she began, as if saying it out loud might lessen the weight of her words. We were supposed to be talking about the project, but somehow, we ended up sharing more personal things. He was going through a tough time. His relationship had ended, and, I don't know, we connected in a way I didn't expect. I stayed quiet, watching her, feeling the last strands of trust unravel. She didn't look at me. Her eyes focused somewhere beyond, as if reliving that night. We talked for hours. At first, it was just innocent things, work, life, but eventually, it turned into something more. He told me things I hadn't heard in a long time, things that made me feel seen, and I let it happen. Her words were like stones dropping into a bottomless well, each one hitting harder than the last. I could feel my hands clench, my jaw tighten, but I forced myself to stay silent, to let her finish. He kissed me, and I didn't stop him. I should have. But I didn't. And one thing led to another. It was over before I knew it. I realized what I'd done, and I felt sick. That's why I came home. I wanted to leave it behind, to put it in the past. Her voice broke, and she looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Ethan, I know I hurt you. I know what I did was wrong. I can't explain it. I can't justify it. But it didn't mean anything. It was a stupid, impulsive mistake, and I swear, it's over. I don't want to lose you because of one night. The pain in her voice, the remorse in her eyes, it all felt real. But as I listened to her confession, as I tried to process the betrayal, I realized that it didn't change anything. Her regret, her guilt, none of it could undo what had happened. The trust we'd built, the foundation we'd laid over the years, was cracked beyond repair. For a long moment, I just looked at her, my heart a twisted knot of hurt and anger. I thought about all the times I trusted her, all the moments I'd believed in her loyalty, her love. And now, it was like I was looking at a stranger, someone I didn't know. Claire, I said finally, my voice steady but cold. You made your choice that night, and I don't think there's anything left for us after this. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in disbelief. Ethan, please, don't say that. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go to counseling. I'll quit my job, anything. Just don't throw us away. I shook my head, feeling the weight of finality settle over me. I'm not the one throwing us away, Claire. You did that when you chose him over me, even if it was just for one night. You lied, you hid it, and now you expect me to just pretend it didn't happen? She reached out, her hand trembling, but I pulled back, unwilling to let her touch me. Ethan, I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. Don't let this ruin everything we've built. I stood up, stepping away from her, my decision firm. I can't forget this, Claire. I can't live with the knowledge that you betrayed me, that you gave a part of yourself to someone else. Maybe you're sorry, maybe you regret it, but that doesn't change the fact that you broke us. She crumpled, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I felt a pang of sympathy, a flicker of the love we'd once shared, but it wasn't enough to mend what she'd shattered. Without another word, I walked out of the bedroom, leaving her behind. I went downstairs, grabbed my jacket, and headed outside, needing to clear my head, to put as much distance between us as I could. As I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, my mind drifted over everything we'd been through together. All the good memories, the promises, the moments I'd thought would last forever. And now, it was all ashes blown away by one night of reckless impulse, by one decision that couldn't be taken back. By the time I returned home, the house was dark and silent. Claire was still upstairs, the door to our bedroom closed. I could feel the emptiness in the house, the echo of what we'd lost, and I knew that things would never be the same. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and difficult conversations. Claire tried to reach out, to apologize, to convince me that we could salvage something from the wreckage, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I was done. Done with the lies, the half-truths, the betrayal. I needed to start over, to build a life that wasn't defined by her mistakes. In the end, we went through with the divorce quietly, without any drama or bitterness. She moved out, taking only what she needed, and left me with the house, a hollow reminder of the life we'd once shared. There were no last-minute attempts to reconcile, no tearful goodbyes. Just a simple, painful acknowledgement that what we'd had was gone. As the months passed, I found myself letting go, piece by piece, of the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. I focused on my work, on rebuilding my life, on finding a sense of peace in the solitude. And eventually, I realized that maybe, in a strange way, the ending had given me a new beginning, a chance to find something real, something that wouldn't be tainted by lies and regret. Claire's memory faded, becoming just another part of my past, a chapter that had ended. And as I looked forward to the future, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet strength that told me I could move on, that I could build a life that was mine alone. The scars would remain, the memories would linger, but I'd found a way to let go, to forgive myself for trusting too easily, for believing in something that wasn't meant to last. And in that acceptance, I found a kind of freedom, a peace that I hadn't known in years. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.